Hello, if you're hearing my voice tonight, it means you've come here looking for a place to rest. You've chosen well. You don't need to keep your eyes open for this story. In fact, it's better if you let them close. Just listen and let me take you somewhere, far away and long ago, to a place that no longer exists, to a village that vanished. I have lived 1,000 years. Yes, 1,000. A full millennium of memories. Some are joyful, some are bitter, and some, like the one I'm about to tell you, feel more like dreams than memories. But they are all mine. I have walked through countless cities, fields, forests, and deserts. I've seen kingdoms rise and crumble, watched lovers promise eternity and then forget each other's names. I've held hands with dying kings and listened to newborns take their first breath. And yet, through all the centuries, there is one place that lingers in my mind like the echo of a song I can no longer hum. A place you will never find on any map. A place I cannot return to. The village that vanished. When I first arrived at that village, I did not intend to stay. I never intended to stay anywhere. But it had a quietness, a stillness, a warmth that settled into my bones. I can still feel it if I close my eyes. The scent of bread baking in the mornings, the sound of children running down cobblestone streets, the way the sun would sink behind the hills and paint the sky in gold and violet, as if the heavens themselves leaned down to kiss the earth goodnight. I didn't know then how precious it would all become, how easily it would all slip away. They welcomed me there, though I was a stranger. They offered me a bed, a meal, and smiles that seemed to have no end. I remember the old woman who sold herbs from a basket, and the boy who fed the birds each dawn. I remember the way the river curled through the village like a silver ribbon, and how the moon would reflect on it at night, so brightly you could almost believe it was another sky below your feet. I thought I would stay for a week, maybe 2, but weeks turned into months, and months into years. I forgot about the rest of the world. I forgot about time itself. That was before the whispers began, before the nights grew colder, before the shadows in the woods grew longer, and the laughter in the streets grew softer, before the village began to vanish. But that is the story I am here to tell you, and tonight I will tell it all. From the very first moment I set foot in that quiet little corner of the earth, to the moment it was gone. So lie down now, breathe slowly, feel the weight of the day leave your body. You are safe here, with me, and when you're ready, we will begin. I remember the road that led me there. It was narrow, lined with tall trees whose branches tangled above me, blotting out the sun. The air smelled of damp earth and distant flowers. Each step felt heavier, but I kept walking. Something about that path pulled me forward, as though I had walked it before, perhaps in a dream. The closer I came, the quieter the world became. The birds no longer sang. The wind no longer rustled the leaves. My footsteps seemed to echo louder than they should have. And then, through the trees, I saw it. The village. It was small, almost hidden between 2 hills, as if the earth itself was trying to protect it. Tiny houses with thatched roofs, smoke curling lazily from chimneys, and narrow streets made of worn stones that shone in the afternoon light. I stopped and simply watched. A gentle river circled the village like a silver bracelet. Its waters sparkled even though the sky had grown dim. On its banks, I saw a little boy tossing breadcrumbs to a flock of white birds, who danced and called out in delight as they ate. I stepped closer, and the boy turned to look at me. His eyes were wide, curious but not afraid. He smiled a quiet, knowing smile as though he had been waiting for me. He didn't speak, but he pointed toward the heart of the village, and then returned to his birds. I followed the path into the center. Every few steps, I passed another villager. An old man repairing a chair outside his home. A young woman hanging linen to dry. 2 children chasing each other with wild laughter. Each of them glanced at me and nodded, warm and calm. When I reached the square, there was a fountain, its water falling into a stone basin with a gentle trickle. Carved into its base were symbols I didn't recognize, worn by time but still beautiful. Around the square, shops and houses stood like quiet sentinels, each door open. An older woman approached me then. She wore a dark dress, and her hands were weathered, but her eyes were bright and kind. Without a word, she reached out, taking my arm lightly, and led me to one of the houses at the edge of the square. Inside, the air smelled of herbs and bread. The walls were lined with shelves full of jars and baskets of dried flowers. There was a table already set for two, though she and I had not spoken yet. She gestured to the chair and I sat down. She poured me a cup of tea. At last, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Welcome," she said. "We have been waiting for you." I opened my mouth to ask what she meant, but she only smiled, shook her head, and placed a warm slice of bread in front of me. "Eat, you've traveled far." And so I ate, and drank, and felt something in me loosen, as though I had been carrying a burden I had long forgotten, and here, it could finally rest. Outside, the sun sank below the hills, and golden light filled the room. I felt myself breathing easier. That night, they gave me a room at the back of the house. The bed was soft, covered in a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. I lay there listening to the sounds of the village outside, the laughter of children, the river's soft song, the distant hoot of an owl, and for the first time in years, I slept. In the days that followed, I began to know the village better. Each morning, the sun painted the hills in gold, and the air smelled of bread and fresh earth. The streets always had live children playing, merchants calling out, neighbors greeting each other with soft smiles. And yet, there was a quietness beneath it all, like a secret waiting to be uncovered. I spent hours by the river, watching the birds and listening to the water. The boy I'd seen my first day often joined me, though he spoke little. Instead, he'd point to things: a bird in flight, a fish glinting beneath the surface, and look at me as if asking if I understood. I never quite did. The villagers welcomed me into their lives without question. They gave me work repairing fences, gathering firewood, tending the gardens. The old man who'd been fixing a chair taught me how to mend baskets. The young woman who hung linen showed me how to dye cloth with crushed berries. They shared their stories with me too. Tales of ancestors who had built the village, of festivals long past, of winters so harsh they'd all huddled in one house to survive. Their stories were simple, but they carried a weight, a depth, that made them feel like more than just memories. At night, the square came alive with light. Lanterns hung from every doorway, and music drifted through the air: soft flutes, quiet drums, and the occasional voice singing low. Couples danced slowly on the stones, their shadows flickering in the lamplight. I would sit at the edge, watching, feeling both part of it and apart from it. And yet, sometimes, when the laughter faded and the music grew softer, I'd catch a glimpse of something at the edges of the square. A figure standing too still, too dark, watching, or a shadow moving where no shadow should. Each time I blinked, it was gone. I told myself it was only my imagination. But then there were the whispers, always just out of reach. Sometimes, as I lay in bed, I'd hear them: soft, urgent murmurs, like wind through the trees, but carrying words I almost understood. Other times they came from the river, curling around the stones and slipping into my ears. I asked the boy about them once. We were sitting by the riverbank when I heard the whispers again, faint but clear. He simply looked at me and shook his head, then pressed a finger to his lips. I didn't ask again. Still, the days passed gently. The seasons began to turn. Flowers gave way to fruit. Warm winds turned cool. I celebrated the harvest festival with them, dancing in the square, drinking sweet wine, laughing until my sides hurt. The old woman who'd welcomed me clapped my shoulder and said, "You belong here now," and I believed her. For a time, I forgot the shadows, the whispers, the faint chill that sometimes slid through the village when no wind blew. I forgot everything beyond those hills. I let the quiet peace of the place fill me, and for the first time in centuries, I felt home. It was during the winter that I began to notice the first real changes. The cold came earlier that year, biting at the air, frosting the windows before the sun had fully set. The villagers still smiled, still laughed, but something behind their eyes had shifted, like a candle burning lower in its glass. At night, the music grew softer, the lanterns dimmer. The shadows in the square lingered longer than they should, pooling in the corners and stretching across the stones like dark water. And always, the whispers grew louder. One evening, as I crossed the square, I saw the boy standing by the fountain. He was staring into the water, unmoving, his reflection broken by the ripples. I called to him, but he didn't answer. Only when I reached him did he finally turn his head and look at me, his eyes dark, unreadable. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were no longer content to stay at the edge of hearing. They pressed closer now, filling my room, curling around my bed like smoke. I tried covering my ears, but still I heard them soft, insistent words I couldn't understand. The next morning, the old man was gone. His chair sat unfinished outside his door, tools scattered, a thin layer of frost covering them. I asked the villagers where he'd gone, but they only shook their heads and returned to their work, their smiles tighter than before. A few days later, the young woman who'd taught me to dye cloth also disappeared. Her linens still hung on the line, stiff with frost, swaying in the wind. Again I asked, and again the villagers gave no answer. They only looked at me with that quiet sadness in their eyes. More and more, the square emptied at night. The music faltered, the dancing stopped. Even the river seemed to slow, its song muted, as though it too was holding its breath. And still, the whispers grew louder. I began to see them then, not just shadows, but shapes stole. Thin figures at the edge of the trees, watching silently. Sometimes at dawn, I would catch them slipping through the streets, too quick to follow but leaving behind a faint chill that clung to the stones. One evening, as I walked back to my room, I turned a corner and found the boy waiting for me. He took my hand without a word and led me to the river. There, he pointed to the water, and for the first time, I saw it clearly faces beneath the surface, pale and still, staring up with eyes full of sorrow. I stumbled back, but the boy only watched me. He pressed a finger to his lips again, then slowly turned and walked away, leaving me alone by the river's edge, the whispers rising around me like a storm. From that night on, I knew the village was slipping away. Piece by piece, it was fading its people, its light, its warmth. And yet, I could not leave. Something bound me there, held me fast, as though my own shadow had been stitched into the stones of that quiet square. The days grew shorter. The sun barely crept above the hills before sinking again, leaving the village in a dusky twilight that seemed to cling to everything. The air was heavy now, and each breath tasted faintly of stone and ash, though no fires burned. The villagers spoke even less. They moved through the streets like ghosts, their eyes fixed on the ground, their footsteps soundless. Doors that once stood open were now shut tight, and the windows glowed only faintly at night, as if the light feared to shine. I tried to speak to them, to ask what was happening, but their answers, when they came at all, were vague. "It's the way of things," one man murmured before turning away. "It happens to all of us," said another, though she would not meet my gaze. No one would. The boy stopped coming to the river. For days I sat there alone, listening to the whispers that now rose from the water itself low, mournful, like the sound of 100 voices calling from beneath the surface. Sometimes I thought I could make out my own name among them. One night, I woke to find the old woman standing at the foot of my bed. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes dark and shining. She spoke only one word, "Soon." Then she turned and walked away, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I followed her outside into the square. The fountain had stopped flowing, its basin cracked and dry. The air was thick with silence. Around me, the houses stood like empty shells, their doors hanging open, their windows dark. I could feel the village breathing, slow and shallow, as though it were alive and dying all at once. At the edge of the square, I saw them again, the tall, thin figures, more of them now, standing in a perfect circle. Their shapes were clearer than before, their faces hidden beneath hoods that moved as though stirred by an invisible wind. They raised their hands toward me. The ground beneath my feet grew cold, and the whispers became a roar. I fell to my knees, clutching my head, as the voices poured through me memories that weren't mine, names I didn't know, sorrow so deep it threatened to drown me. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. When I opened my eyes, the square was empty again. The figures were gone. The villagers were gone. Only the boy remained, standing in the center of the square, looking at me with that same quiet, knowing smile. He raised his hand and pointed toward the river. I stumbled toward it, my legs heavy, my breath coming in shallow gasps. When I reached the water's edge, I saw the reflection of the moon shimmering on its surface, and beneath it, the faces, hundreds of them now, staring up at me, their mouths open in silent cries. And then I understood. The village had never been a place you could find on any map. It was a memory, a fragment caught between worlds. And now, it was fading, slipping back into whatever darkness it had come from. And still, I could not leave. The river no longer flowed. It lay still, dark as obsidian, its surface reflecting nothing but emptiness. The boy stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my sleeve, his eyes fixed on the water as though waiting for something I could not see. All around us, the air shimmered, and the village seemed to waver, houses bending and stretching like smoke, streets folding in on themselves. The square cracked and split, the stones crumbling into dust, and yet there was no sound, only silence. I turned to the boy and finally spoke. "What is this place?" My voice felt strange in the quiet, as though the air swallowed it before it reached him. He didn't answer. He simply raised his hand and pointed again, this time not at the river, but at me. A chill ran through me then, colder than any winter wind. I looked down at my hands, and for the first time, I saw them clearly, pale, translucent, like the faces beneath the river's surface. My fingers trembled, and when I tried to speak again, my breath came out in a thin white mist. I staggered back toward the square. The buildings leaned away from me, their walls cracking and fading into darkness. The lanterns blinked out one by one, leaving only faint traces of light that dissolved as I reached for them. The old woman appeared then, standing by the fountain, or what was left of it. Her eyes met mine, and I understood what she had meant that night when she whispered, "Soon." Her lips moved now, though no sound came, and I could almost read the words, "You are part of it." I fell to my knees, my hands sinking into the stones as though they were water. The whispers rose again, louder than ever, filling me with memories that were not mine, births and deaths, seasons passing, laughter and grief, all blending together until I could no longer tell which were my own. The boy approached and knelt beside me. He reached out and placed his hand over my heart, and the whispers quieted. The chill faded. For a moment, I felt warmth again, like the sun on my face, like bread baking in the morning, like home. And then the boy spoke. His voice was soft, but it carried through the empty square. "You have always been here," he said. "You were the first to arrive, and you will be the last to leave." I tried to protest, to tell him that I was only a traveler, that I had stumbled upon this place by chance. But as I looked around, I saw the truth written in every shadow, every cracked stone, every vanished face. This was not just a village I had found. It was a part of me, and I was a part of it. The boy stood, his figure growing fainter, as though the air itself was swallowing him. One by one, the remaining fragments of the village dissolved into darkness, leaving only the river and me behind. I stood at its edge, staring into the black water, and for the first time, I saw my own face reflected there, pale and still, among the others. I don't know how long I stood there, at the river's edge, watching my reflection among the countless others. Time had lost its meaning. The sky above me no longer shifted between day and night. It was only darkness now, soft, endless, and still. The whispers had quieted, replaced by a silence so deep it felt alive. It wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, pressing me into the stones beneath my feet, urging me not to move, not to speak, only to listen. Slowly, I turned away from the water. The village, what remained of it, was nothing but faint outlines now, barely more than memories etched into the air. I walked through the square, my footsteps soundless, my hands brushing against walls that dissolved into dust as I touched them. The boy appeared again, standing at the center of the square, waiting. His figure shimmered, almost transparent, but his gaze was steady, calm. He nodded at me, and though he didn't speak, I understood. It was time to let go. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. The air was cool and carried the faint scent of earth and stone. Memories began to rise within me, not just of this village, but of countless others. Faces I had forgotten, names I had never spoken aloud, moments of joy and sorrow layered like the rings of an ancient tree. Each memory settled over me like falling leaves, and I felt myself growing heavier and lighter at the same time. Heavier with the weight of everything I had seen, and lighter as though the burden no longer belonged only to me. When I opened my eyes, the boy was gone. In his place stood the old woman, her hands folded in front of her, her face calm and kind. She reached out and touched my cheek, her fingers cool and steady. Then she whispered one last word, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "Home." And then she too faded, leaving me alone in the square, the last fragment of the village clinging to the air around me like mist. I stood there for what felt like years, though perhaps it was only a moment, feeling the stillness seep into my bones. At last, I walked back to the river. Its surface was smooth now, dark and deep, but no longer frightening. I knelt at its edge and placed my hand upon the water. It rippled beneath my fingers, and for the first time, I felt peace. The village was gone. Its streets, its houses, its people all returned to the quiet from which they'd come. But within me, they remained. Every face, every word, every whisper. They were part of me now, as I had always been part of them. And so I sat there, by the river's edge, watching the dark water flow beneath the endless sky, and waited for whatever would come next. As I sat by the river, time drifted around me like smoke. I no longer felt cold or tired. My hands rested in my lap, and the whispers had faded completely, replaced by a quiet so complete it seemed to hum in my chest. Memories began to surface, unbidden, not just of the village but of places far beyond. Cities of marble and gold, their streets bright with banners and laughter. I remembered walking through markets full of spices and strange music, the air thick with the scent of incense. I remembered deserts where the sand burned beneath my feet and stars crowded the sky like countless watchful eyes. I remembered mountain peaks sharp against the clouds, where the air was so thin each breath felt like a prayer, and forests, endless forests, where the trees spoke in a language only the wind could understand. Faces rose in my mind, to a girl with hair like fire who taught me how to smile again, a soldier who died in my arms, whispering the name of someone he'd never see again, a child who placed a flower in my hand and ran away laughing. All of them flickered through me now, one after another. And yet, of all the places I had been, of all the people I had met, it was here, this quiet, vanishing village, that felt most like home. I wondered why that was. Perhaps it was because here, at last, there was no need to run, no need to pretend I was just passing through. The river shimmered faintly in the dark, its surface calm. I reached down and touched it again, and as my fingers broke the surface, I felt all those memories settle inside me, no longer jumbled or heavy. They simply were like stones at the bottom of a stream. I closed my eyes and listened, half expecting the whispers to return. But there was nothing now, only the faint sound of water and the distant echo of wind through the hollow streets. I breathed slowly and let myself sink deeper into that silence. I thought of the boy, his quiet smile, his small hand guiding me to the river. I thought of the old woman, her kind eyes, her final word, home. I realized then that perhaps this was what I had been searching for all along, not a place, but a stillness, a way to finally belong. The darkness around me felt less heavy now, as though it welcomed me. The village itself seemed to have settled into me, its streets and stones and stories no longer out there but within, carried in my chest like a quiet flame. And so I sat there, unmoving, letting the memories wash over me. Above, the sky stretched on forever, full of stars I could almost name but no longer needed to. Below, the river flowed on, soft and steady, carrying everything it had ever seen. The thought came to me slowly, like dawn creeping over distant hills. I was no longer merely a visitor here. I was something else, a witness, a keeper, the one who would remember when no one else could. I rose from the riverbank, though the ground beneath me no longer felt solid. The stones gave way like mist beneath my feet, yet I walked steadily, knowing exactly where to go. Every path led back to the square, though the square itself was little more than shadow now. The fountain was gone, but I could still hear the faint trickle of water, as if it remembered itself even when its form had faded. The outlines of houses glowed faintly, and I could sense the lives that had once filled them, laughter, arguments, soft songs drifting through windows. I passed through the streets, touching the empty doorframes, and with each touch, memories bloomed in my mind. A wedding held in the square, garlands strung between the houses. A winter night, when every window burned bright against the snow. A festival of lights, where children danced with lanterns shaped like stars. Each memory settled into me, becoming part of me. I no longer felt the urge to leave. Why would I? This was where the stories lived now, and someone had to keep them alive. At the edge of the square, I saw the boy again, or perhaps only his shadow. He watched me silently, his face calm, his eyes bright. When I reached him, he held out his hand. In his palm lay a single, smooth stone etched with a symbol I didn't recognize. I took it from him and held it close. The stone was warm, pulsing faintly, as though it carried the heartbeat of the entire village within it. The boy nodded once, then faded, leaving me alone again. I stood there for a long time, turning the stone over in my hands, feeling its quiet weight. And slowly, I understood. This was my task. To stay, to remember, to bear witness, so that even as the village vanished, it would not truly be gone. The darkness around me no longer frightened me. It felt gentle now, like a thick blanket on a cold night. I closed my eyes and listened not for whispers, but for the quiet hum of the stories that still lingered in the stones and the river and the stars. And there, standing in the heart of what was left, I began to speak, softly at first, then louder, until my voice carried through the empty streets, telling their stories, one by one, names, moments, laughter, tears all woven together into a single, endless tale. The longer I stood in the square, the more the darkness around me began to shift and heavier, not darker, but alive somehow, like a vast ocean waiting for my breath. The faint outlines of houses shimmered like faint constellations, and the air itself pulsed with quiet expectation. The stone in my hand grew warmer. I pressed it to my chest, and it seemed to settle into me, as though it had always belonged there. My breath slowed. My voice softened, but I continued speaking, reciting names I didn't know I remembered, recounting stories I hadn't lived but somehow carried within me. The river behind me glowed faintly now, its surface shimmering with soft light. Ripples moved outward in perfect circles, as though echoing the rhythm of my words. And then, I noticed the shadows gathering in the square knot, menacing now, but familiar. They stood all around me, the villagers, though they were more like outlines now, faint glimmers of light and shape. The boy was among them, his quiet smile steady, his small hand clasping another's. The old woman stood at the front, her kind eyes watching me with approval. One by one, they began to move, circling the square in silence, their feet not touching the stones. They carried faint lights in their hands, lanterns, candles, or perhaps only memories of such things. Their glow lit the square in soft gold. I felt my feet moving with them, slowly at first, then in steady rhythm. I followed their path around the square. The stone in my chest grew heavier, warmer, as though it was drawing all of their light into me. I did not resist. We moved together, a quiet procession of memory and shadow. The whispers did not return. There was no need. The stories were no longer hidden. They were here, in the circle, in the air, in me. I closed my eyes and let them pass through me, like wind through trees. As we completed the final circle, the figures began to fade again, but their lights remained, rising into the air like tiny stars and settling above the square. The boy was the last to vanish. He met my gaze, nodded once, and released the hand he was holding. Then he too became light, drifting upward. I stood alone now, but I was not empty. The lights above me pulsed gently, as though waiting for me to finish what had been started. I placed my hands over the stone in my chest and whispered a single word, "Remember." At that, the lights shimmered brighter, then slowly faded into the endless dark sky, leaving the square quiet and still once more. But inside me, the warmth remained, steady and calm. I understood then that this was the ritual, not an ending, but a continuation, a promise that no story would ever truly vanish, so long as someone remembered. I stood there, in the quiet square, long after the lights had faded. My hands still rested over the stone in my chest, feeling its slow, steady rhythm. The air around me no longer felt cold or heavy. It was soft now, as if it recognized me, as if it finally knew I belonged. Above me, the stars shifted, faint trails of light dancing across the sky. And then, very slowly, the blackness began to pale. At first, I thought it was only another memory rising within me. But no, on the distant horizon, a faint glow began to spread, like the first blush of dawn. It was strange, watching the light return. For so long, I had only known the darkness here, the endless quiet of night. Yet, as the pale gold bled into the sky, I felt no fear. The light was gentle, cautious, like a guest entering a long-deserted room. The river began to shimmer again, its surface catching the faint rays and scattering them like broken glass. The square brightened just enough to reveal the outlines of the buildings again, faint but steady. The air smelled of earth after rain, cool and clean. I walked slowly to the edge of the square, where the path to the hills began. With each step the light grew warmer on my skin, and I realized I could feel the stones beneath my feet again, solid, real, though still quiet and hollow. I reached the top of the hill and looked back. The village below lay bathed in that soft morning light, its streets and houses still faint, more memory than matter, yet beautiful. Smoke rose faintly from one chimney. I could almost hear the laughter of children again, faint but clear. I stood there for a long while, watching the sun rise higher, feeling the warmth settle into me. The stone in my chest pulsed in rhythm with the light, and I understood. This place was not only a memory, not only a shadow. It was alive, as long as I was alive to carry it. The boy's smile came to me then, unbidden but welcome. I thought of the old woman's kind eyes, of the villagers' quiet acceptance, of the stories that had passed through me like wind through leaves. They were here still, all of them, as much a part of this dawn as the light itself. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of everything and nothing at all. I was no longer a visitor, no longer a stranger. I was the keeper, the witness, the quiet flame that would burn so no memory would be lost to the dark. When I opened my eyes, the sun had climbed higher. The village below shimmered faintly, caught between worlds, but peaceful now, no longer fading, no longer afraid. And in that stillness, I felt a quiet joy bloom in my chest. For the first time in what felt like 1,000 years, I smiled. The sun rose higher, spilling its light across the hills and into the quiet streets below. Though the village shimmered faintly, more memory than stone, it seemed steadier now, as though it had chosen to stay a little longer. I began to walk again, not because I needed to go anywhere, but because my feet remembered the paths. They carried me through streets I thought I'd forgotten, past doorways that still held the scent of bread and herbs, past windows that caught the light like fragments of stars. The air was warm, touched with the faint sound of the river, steady and calm. I let my hands drift over the stones of the walls as I passed, feeling the faint pulse of stories still tucked into their cracks, tiny moments waiting to be remembered. At the edge of the village, where the stones gave way to soft grass, I paused and turned. From here, the square looked like a faint echo of its former self, yet no less beautiful. The faint figures of the villagers stood in the distance, not moving, not speaking, simply present. One of them lifted a hand, and though no words came, I felt their meaning clearly. Continue. I stepped off the stones and onto the grass, letting the warmth of the earth seep into me. The river curved gently away in the distance, and beyond it stretched a wide plain dotted with faint memories of other places. A line of distant trees, a faint tower, a patch of wildflowers swaying in invisible wind. As I walked, memories began to surface once more, older this time, deeper. I remembered a city carved into the face of a mountain, its streets narrow and full of whispers. I remembered a temple where bells sang for days without stopping. I remembered a single oak tree on a lonely hill, its branches spread wide to catch the sky. The path beneath me shimmered with each step, shifting between stone and grass, earth and water. It carried me forward through the plain of memories, each one unfolding quietly around me, not demanding, only waiting to be acknowledged. In the distance, I saw a faint bridge stretching over a dark stream. It glowed softly, etched with markings I could almost recognize, though their meaning eluded me. The air here was cooler, filled with a quiet hum, as though the stones themselves were breathing. I approached the bridge and placed my hand on its railing. The surface was smooth, warm to the touch, and pulsed faintly another heartbeat, another story waiting to be carried. I stood there for a while, feeling its rhythm join mine. Then, without hurry, I stepped onto the bridge and continued walking. The river below reflecting faint stars even in the daylight. The memories continued to rise around me, gentle and patient, each one settling into place, like pieces of a vast mosaic I was only beginning to see. The bridge carried me farther than I expected, its surface glowing faintly beneath my feet. Each step seemed to stretch the distance between what had been and what was still to come. Below, the water flowed silently, a mirror to the sky, scattered with faint stars, even though the sun still hovered above. On the far side of the bridge, the ground changed. The grass was darker here, softer, and the air was cooler, touched with something ancient. Ahead rose a hill, crowned with a circle of stones that stood like sentinels. Between them, faint threads of light stretched from one stone to the next, weaving a quiet pattern that shifted as I watched. I began climbing, the earth yielding slightly with each step. The closer I came, the more the whispers returned, not the ones that once filled the village, but softer now, gentler. They weren't pulling me anymore. They were guiding me, urging me onward. At the top of the hill, the stones stood tall, weathered yet unbroken. Their surfaces shimmered faintly, covered in markings that seemed to move under my gaze. The threads of light hummed softly, and as I stepped into the circle, the air thickened, filled with the quiet weight of countless memories. I stood in the center, letting the silence settle over me. The threads of light began to pulse slowly, and images bloomed in the air between the stones, glimpses of places I had been, people I had known, a woman's laugh under a canopy of blossoms, a marketplace alive with color and sound, a battlefield strewn with armor and sorrow. The images shifted again, showing me the village not as it had been, but as it was now, faint and fragile, held together by memory and quiet determination. The figures of the villagers appeared at the edges of the circle, watching me silently, their forms faint but present. One by one, they raised their hands, and the light from the threads grew stronger, weaving around me in intricate patterns. I could feel it settling into my skin, into the stone in my chest, filling me with warmth that was almost too much to bear. Then the boy appeared again, just outside the circle. He didn't enter, but he met my gaze and nodded slowly. His eyes seemed older now, deeper, as though he carried more than his small form could hold. Without speaking, he gestured toward the center stone. I reached out and placed both hands on it. The surface was warm, thrumming with quiet power. The markings beneath my palms began to shift, glowing faintly, and the threads of light wrapped around me completely. I could feel everything, the weight of the village, the echoes of its stories, the lives and loves and losses of everyone who had ever walked its streets. I stayed there, my hands resting on the stone, feeling the memories flow through me like a river. Some were bright and joyful, others sharp and full of sorrow, but all of them were precious. Each memory settled into place within me, and I felt myself becoming something more than I had been. The boy's voice finally came not from his lips, but from the air around me, quiet yet clear. "You are the keeper now," he said. "You are the bridge." As the words sank into me, the light began to dim, fading back into the stones. The threads loosened and dissolved, leaving only the faint hum of their presence. The figures of the villagers lowered their hands and began to drift away, one by one, until only the boy remained. He stepped closer this time, his faint form almost solid. He placed his small hand over mine on the stone, and for a moment, the circle glowed once more, soft and golden. Then he smiled, let go, and turned away, walking down the hill until he too faded into the quiet. I stood there for a long time, my hand still pressed to the stone, feeling the warmth slowly seep into me. When at last I let go, the stone was cool again, its markings still and silent, but inside me, the glow remained. Turning, I looked out over the hill. Below, the village shimmered faintly, bathed in the soft light of the rising sun. The streets were empty now, but they no longer felt abandoned. The quiet that filled them was not loss, it was peace. I descended the hill slowly, each step steady, feeling the earth beneath me with new certainty. The air around me was calm, carrying the faint scent of river and stone, and the whispers had settled into a quiet hum in my chest. As I reached the bridge again, I paused and looked back. The circle of stones stood tall against the sky, their faint glow just visible, waiting patiently for whatever might come next. And I knew then that I would always find my way back here. Crossing the bridge, the village opened before me once more, soft, faint, but full of memory. The streets welcomed me, the stones steady underfoot, and as I walked back into the square, I felt the weight of the stone in my chest grow warmer, a quiet reminder of the task I had chosen to carry. Back in the square, the silence no longer felt empty. It was full, now woven with whispers I could understand, with memories that moved gently through the air like drifting petals. Each breath carried the faint warmth of stories waiting to be told. I walked slowly through the streets. Every doorway I passed seemed to nod at me. Every window reflected faint light, even though there were no flames inside. It was as though the village itself had turned its quiet gaze upon me, recognizing me now as one of its own. At the fountain or where it had been, I paused. The stone basin was cracked and dry, but a faint glimmer of water shimmered at the bottom, as if unwilling to vanish completely. I knelt and touched the surface with my fingertips. A ripple spread outward, and in that moment I heard them voices, faint but clear. They came from far beyond the village, carried through whatever space lay between here and the rest of the world. Some voices were soft, others cracked with age, some full of fear, others laced with hope, but all of them shared the same quiet longing to be remembered. I stood and let the ripple fade. The stone in my chest pulsed gently, as though answering the voices, promising them something I did not yet fully understand. My hands felt warm, and my feet began to move of their own accord, carrying me down a narrow path I had never noticed before. This path led away from the square, curling between faint rows of houses whose outlines were so delicate now they seemed made of fog. The ground beneath me shifted as I walked, sometimes stone, sometimes grass, sometimes only light. At the end of the path, I came to a small clearing surrounded by tall, thin trees. Their branches reached high, tangled together, forming a canopy that filtered the faint light above into soft golden patterns. In the center of the clearing was a single chair, simple and unadorned. I approached and sat down. The wood was warm, almost alive, and as soon as I settled into it, the air changed. It thickened, carrying with it a gentle hum that rose and fell in rhythm with my breath. Before me, the air shimmered and opened. A faint figure appeared, then another, and another. They stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me quietly. Some I recognized faces from the village, the boy, the old woman. Others were strangers, but somehow familiar, as though I'd carried pieces of them within me all along. One of them stepped forward. His form was faint but steady, and though his features were hidden, his voice reached me clearly. "You are their keeper now," he said. "Your memory is their shelter. Your voice is their bridge." The words settled over me, not heavy, but inevitable. I bowed my head slightly, accepting what I already knew to be true. The figure continued, his voice soft but certain. "There are others like you once were walking through the dark. They seek what you have found. Call to them." I lifted my gaze and met his unseen eyes. Slowly, I began to speak, not loudly, not with force, but with steady calm. I spoke of the village, of its streets and square, its river and stones, its quiet peace. I spoke of its people, their laughter, their sorrow, their quiet strength. As I spoke, the air around me brightened. The faint figures at the edge of the clearing drew closer, their outlines sharper now, their faces clearer. They listened, and with each word, their forms grew steadier, their presence warmer. More figures appeared beyond them, faint at first, like shadows on water, but drawn by the sound of my voice. They stood in silence, listening, their eyes wide with quiet longing. And I spoke on. I told them of the bridge, the circle of stones, the whispers that became a song. I told them how the village had vanished, yet remained, how every memory was still here, waiting for them to arrive and be carried within me. The figures began to nod, some placing their hands over their chests, where a faint glow began to form, as if their own stones had awakened. One by one, they stepped closer, entering the clearing, joining the quiet chorus of memory. The air was warm now, filled with soft light. I felt it settle into my skin, into the chair, into the earth beneath me, and the faint hum that had surrounded me before grew into a quiet melody, low, patient, and full of peace. When the last figure had joined the circle, the first one who had spoken raised his hand, and the melody softened. His voice reached me again. "You are no longer alone." And he was right. Around me stood countless souls, each carrying a fragment of the same quiet flame, each part of the same story. Their faces were calm, their eyes steady, their presence as familiar to me now as my own breath. For the first time, I realized the village had never been a place on a map. It had always been hairwoven between memory and silence, carried in the hearts of those who needed it most, and I was its voice. The clearing shimmered with faint golden light, and the figures surrounding me waited in quiet expectation. Their faces held no urgency, no fear, only trust, as though they already understood the path I would help them walk. I rose slowly from the chair. The warmth of the wood lingered in my hands as I stepped forward into the circle of waiting souls. Their forms parted gently, creating a path between them that led back toward the faint outline of the village beyond the trees. One by one, they followed as I walked. The air hummed softly, and the ground beneath us seemed more solid now, the stones firmer, the grass brighter. With each step, I could feel their presence growing steadier, more certain, as though the village was calling to them as it once called to me. We passed under the canopy of trees, their branches tangled high above, filtering light into dappled patterns on the ground. The whispers that once haunted me were gone now, replaced by the faint melody that moved between USA's song of memory and belonging. The boy appeared again at the edge of the path. His small form was clearer than ever, his smile calm and knowing. Without a word, he turned and walked ahead of me, leading us back toward the square. As we emerged from the trees, the village opened before us, its streets brighter now, its stones warm with faint light. The river sparkled quietly in the distance, and the faint outlines of houses seemed more substantial with each passing moment. The figures around me breathed softly, and some even reached out to touch the walls and windows as we passed. Wherever their fingers brushed, faint colors returned: gold on the stones, green in the ivy, blue in the shutters. The village was awakening again, piece by piece. We arrived at the square, where the fountain shimmered faintly, its water trickling once more into the cracked basin. The boy stood by its edge, waiting. When I reached him, he gestured to the villagers behind me, and I understood what needed to happen next. I turned to them and began to speak, not loudly, but with quiet certainty. I told them what I had learned, that the village was not just a place to rest, but a place to remember, that every shadow held a story, every stone carried a name. One by one, they stepped forward, each placing a hand on the fountain's edge. As they did, the water grew brighter, its surface reflecting not only the stars above, but the faint glow of their own stones within their chests. The boy nodded, and I continued guiding them. We moved through the square, through the streets, past the doorways and windows, now alive with color and warmth. I showed them the circle of stones on the hill, the bridge over the river, the paths that led through memory and silence alike. And as we walked, I began to hear their voices, soft at first, then stronger, joining mine. They began telling their own stories, of places they had come from, of names they thought they'd forgotten, of moments that had defined them even after the world moved on. Their words filled the air, weaving into the quiet melody that lingered above the square. The village seemed to breathe with us, its stones humming faintly, its lights pulsing in rhythm with the stories we spoke aloud. At the center of the square, the old woman appeared again, her hands folded gently, her eyes bright with approval. She nodded at me, then at the circle of souls around me, and though she did not speak, her meaning was clear. They had found their place. I stepped back, letting them move through the streets, finding the spaces where they belonged. Some lingered by the river, some at doorways, some gathered near the fountain, their voices blending into a quiet chorus of memory and peace. The boy approached one last time, his eyes meeting mine. His hand rested briefly over the stone in my chest, and for a moment I felt the hum of every story, every memory, every quiet moment that had ever passed through this place. When he stepped away, I stood alone again at the center of the square, but this time I was not afraid. Around me, the village shimmered softly, full of life and silence, light and shadow, memory and hope. And so, I waited for the next to arrive. The square glowed faintly, and the air carried the hum of dozens of voices mingling with the quiet melody that never truly left this place. The newly arrived souls had settled into their spaces by the river, along the streets, within doorways and windows. The village itself had grown brighter, more solid, like a canvas being repainted stroke by patient stroke. I stood at the center, feeling the weight of the stone in my chest, steady and warm. Its rhythm now matched the faint pulse of the square, and I sensed that every memory they spoke aloud became part of the walls, the stones, the sky itself. The boy appeared only briefly now, always just at the edge of sight, watching. He no longer needed to guide me. My hands knew where to go, my steps knew which path to take. The old woman, too, lingered in the background, her calm gaze never leaving the square, her quiet approval woven into the silence. I walked through the streets slowly, letting the presence of the village settle into me. Every house I passed had its own light now, faint but growing stronger as the souls within spoke their stories. Some sang quietly, their voices weaving into the night air. Others simply sat in silence, their eyes closed, their hands resting over the faint glow of their own stones. At the river, the water flowed more clearly than it ever had. The surface caught the faint light of stars above and scattered it into ripples of silver and gold. Along its banks, some of the new souls sat, dipping their fingers into the water, watching the reflections shift and shimmer. I stopped by the bridge and placed my hand on its railing. It hummed faintly beneath my palm, its surface warm, alive with quiet power. I realized then that the bridge itself had grown longer, stretching farther into the dark horizon than before, as though reaching for others still walking in the night. The circle of stones on the hills shone faintly in the distance. I could see new threads of light weaving between them now, different patterns than before, more intricate, alive with the presence of every story carried into the village. As I walked back toward the square, I passed one of the souls, an older man with deep-set eyes, who sat on the steps of a doorway, speaking softly to no one in particular. I paused to listen. He spoke of a small orchard he once tended, of the quiet joy he found in watching it bloom each spring. He spoke of hands he used to hold, of names he still cherished even after they'd faded from the world. His words carried warmth, and I felt them settle into the stones beneath his feet, becoming part of the village. Farther along, a young woman stood by a window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass. She spoke of journeys she'd never finished, of letters she never sent, of the quiet longing that followed her even here. Her voice was soft but sure, and her memories shimmered faintly, filling the house behind her with quiet light. Everywhere I went, the same. Each soul carried a story, and each story became part of the place. And as they spoke, I felt their memories weaving into my own, not as a burden, but as a gift, filling me with quiet strength. The boy appeared once more at the edge of the square. He watched as I moved among them, his smile faint but steady, and in his gaze, I saw what I had not understood before. The village was no longer just a refuge. It was becoming something new, something more than memory or silence. The stones of the square gleamed softly now, alive with color that shifted like water. The air carried a warmth that came not from the sun, but from the quiet accumulation of countless stories, countless lives folded into one another. I stood again at the fountain, watching its water flow with faint silver light. Around me, the voices continued to rise and fall, some fading, others beginning. The village no longer felt fragile, it felt eternal. And within me, the stone's rhythm steadied, its warmth spreading through every part of me. I could feel the weight of the stories within it, not heavy, but grounding, as though they were the roots of something vast and unseen. I lifted my gaze to the sky. Above, the stars glimmered faintly, but between them, new patterns of light began to form, threads stretching outward, connecting this quiet village to something far beyond it. I realized then, the village was not only for those who came here, it was for all who carried memories too heavy for silence alone. It was a place to set them down, to let them bloom into something brighter, and I was simply its voice. The village no longer shimmered faintly. It glowed now, soft, constant, as though it had finally decided to step fully into being. The stones beneath my feet were warm, the streets bright with quiet color, the air filled with the hum of countless voices blending into a single melody. From the square, I watched as the faint outlines of houses became whole, their windows spilling light into the streets. Doorways stood open, and the gentle sound of laughter and stories drifted through the air, steady and calm. The souls who had gathered here walked with quiet purpose now. Some stood at the river, their reflections solid in the glowing water. Others leaned in doorways, their voices weaving into the tapestry of the village. Every corner of this place was alive, vibrant with memory and presence. At the center of the square, the fountain sparkled, its water dancing as though alive. Around it, the boy appeared clearer than ever before. He stood still, watching, his hands clasped lightly in front of him, his expression calm. I walked to him, feeling the pulse of the stone in my chest grow warmer with each step. The boy nodded once, then gestured to the sky above us. I followed his gaze. Above, the stars had begun to shift again, forming patterns I had never seen before, threads of faint light, stretching outward, connecting the village to distant places I couldn't name. The threads glimmered and swayed, as if moved by some unseen wind, and I felt their pull in my chest. One by one, the threads reached farther, brighter, like roots seeking soil, like rivers seeking the sea. And with each new connection, faint shapes began to appear at the edges of the square, figures walking toward us, drawn by the quiet light, their faces hidden but their presence undeniable. The boy glanced at me, his eyes steady, and though he did not speak, I understood. The village was no longer only a sanctuary for those already here. It had become a beacon calling to others, guiding them through whatever dark lay between where they were and where they longed to be. I stood in the square, feeling the rhythm of the stone in my chest join the hum of the village, the pulse of the threads, the quiet warmth of the souls who already walked these streets. Everything felt woven now, seamless, each memory a part of something vaster, something endless. The old woman appeared then, her form clear and calm, her hands resting lightly over her heart. She moved to the fountain and placed her palm against its surface. The water glowed brighter, and the melody in the air deepened, fuller now, alive with harmony. The new figures who approached stopped at the edges of the square. I could see their uncertainty in the way they lingered, their hesitance written in the shadows clinging to their forms. But they were watching, listening, and so I began to speak, not just to them, but to the threads, to the village, to the quiet itself. I spoke of what I had learned, that silence could hold stories as surely as words, that even in the dark, memory could bloom, that every step taken toward this place carried 1,000 others within it. As I spoke, the figures moved closer, their forms growing steadier, their faces lifting to meet mine. Some placed their hands over their chests, feeling the faint hum of their own stones awakening. Others reached toward the fountain, letting the light wash over them. The boy stood beside me now, his gaze fixed on the newcomers, his quiet approval settling into the air around us. The old woman met my eyes briefly and nodded before fading back into the streets. The village stretched beyond what I could see now, its streets winding farther, its lights brighter. The threads above grew thicker, more numerous, carrying the soft melody into the dark beyond. And for the first time, I felt not only the memories of what had been, but the quiet promise of what was still to come. I understood then that the village was not just made of stories that had already been lived. It was also a place for stories yet to be written, carried here by every soul who chose to walk its streets. And as the newcomers took their first steps into the square, the light of the fountain rose higher, scattering faint sparks into the air. The river below glowed brighter, and the threads above shimmered with quiet joy. I stood among them, my hands steady, my voice calm, the stone in my chest warm with memory and hope. Around me, the village breath not fading now, but growing, and so I welcomed them. The square was alive now with light and quiet sound. The air hummed with the weight of countless stories, and each breath carried the warmth of memories that stretched far beyond what I could see. The newcomers moved through the streets, their presence weaving into the fabric of the village as naturally as rain sinking into thirsty earth. Their voices rose softly, adding new notes to the melody that drifted between the stones and into the sky above. I stood at the fountain, the stone in my chest warm, and for the first time, I felt how vast it all was. The threads above stretched farther than sight could follow, branching and bending, connecting not just here but to other places, other hearts carrying their own quiet flames. One by one, faint glimpses of those places appeared at the edges of my vision, other squares, other rivers, other quiet streets shimmering faintly, each with their own keeper, their own circle of souls, their own stories. And I understood then, this village was not alone. It was one of many, a single point in a great web of memory and silence, a constellation of sanctuaries scattered across whatever lay beyond. The boy appeared again, though now his figure was taller, his eyes deeper, his presence more certain. He watched me for a moment before stepping closer, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but steady. "You are part of something larger than even you can hold," he said, "but you are not meant to hold it alone." His words settled into me, and I could feel them pulse outward through the threads above, through the streets below, through the water and stone of the village. I began to walk again, my feet carrying me through the streets I knew by heart, though they seemed to stretch farther now, turning and winding through spaces that shimmered like half-remembered dreams. Each corner revealed more souls, more quiet figures whose stones glowed faintly as they spoke their memories to the air, and each of them looked at me not for answers, but for recognition, for the quiet reassurance that they, too, belonged here. At the edge of the village, the bridge waited. Its surface glowed brighter now, its span longer, stretching into a horizon that no longer frightened me. I placed my hand on the railing and felt its hum join mine. Beyond the bridge, faint outlines of other keepers stood at the ends of other paths, their silhouettes steady, their stones glowing faintly in their chests, and through the threads above, I could feel their presence calm, watchful, carrying the same weight, the same promise. I realized then that we were all connected not only by the memories we carried, but by the quiet duty we shared, to keep the stories alive, to welcome those who wandered the dark, to remind them they were not lost. The boy's voice came to me again, though he no longer stood beside me. "The stories do not end with you," he said. "They pass through you. They always will." And I understood. I returned to the square, its stones warm beneath my feet, its air full of quiet light. Around me, the villagers spoke and moved, their voices and presence no longer separate from the streets and river and sky. The old woman stood near the fountain, her eyes kind, her hands resting over her own faintly glowing stone. She gave a small nod, and though she didn't speak, her gaze carried the same truth I now felt in my own chest, that what we held was endless. I looked up at the sky. The threads above shimmered and shifted, new patterns forming, stretching farther than I could imagine, carrying the quiet melody of memory into places I would never see but somehow already knew. And for the first time, I smiled, not because I understood it all, but because I no longer needed to. I was part of it now. The square felt different, now, not larger, not smaller, but deeper. The streets no longer led to separate places. They all led here, to this center, to the quiet rhythm that pulsed through stone and air alike. I moved through it slowly, feeling the warmth in my chest extend outward, mingling with the glow of the fountain, the hum of the stones, the faint light that rose from the river. Wherever I walked, the village responded, walls brightening faintly, the air filling with soft notes of the unending melody. The villagers moved with quiet confidence, no longer hesitant. They filled the streets and doorways, their stones glowing faintly, their stories spilling gently into the air. Each word they spoke hung there a moment, then settled into the walls, into the water, into me. The boy no longer appeared, but I felt his presence woven into the threads above, into the stones below, into the calm that spread through everything. His voice lived in the quiet harmony of it all, needing no form now to be heard. I walked to the fountain and sat at its edge. The water rippled faintly, scattering light into my hands. I dipped my fingers into it, and the glow spread up my arm, through my chest, joining the pulse of the stone nestled there. One by one, the figures approached, not to speak, but to stand beside me, their presence steady, their gaze calm. Together we watched the square, the streets, the threads of light above, all shifting and breathing in perfect rhythm. The old woman appeared then, standing at the edge of the square. She walked slowly toward me, her hands clasped in front of her. When she reached me, she placed one hand on my shoulder, the other over the stone in my chest. For a long moment, she stayed like that, her touch neither heavy nor light, simply there, anchoring me to the place I had become part of. Then she stepped back, her smile faint but full of knowing, and faded into the quiet light of the square. Around me, the village grew brighter still, not blinding, not sharp, but steady, like the glow of embers in a long burning fire. The streets stretched outward, each one now lined with faint figures who moved with purpose and peace. I rose from the fountain and began to walk again. My steps were slower now, not from weariness, but because there was no longer any need to hurry. The village was no longer fragile, no longer fading. It was me, and I was it. Every stone I touched hummed with memory, and every breath I took carried the stories of all who had come before. My hands moved over doorframes and walls, feeling the quiet warmth of lives that had passed through here, each one leaving something behind. The river shone like molten silver now, its surface alive with faint reflections of the threads above. I followed its edge, and the water seemed to carry my reflection alongside the others, faces I'd known, faces I'd never seen, all part of the same quiet current. At the bridge, I paused and rested both hands on the railing. The threads above stretched out farther than ever, so far that they vanished into the dark beyond. I felt their pull but no longer feared it. I spoke then, not loudly, not to anyone in particular, only to the quiet, to the streets and stones and threads that wove through everything. "I am here," I said, "and I will remain." The words sank into the air, settled into the stones beneath my feet, rose into the faint stars above. Around me, the figures lifted their heads slightly, their faint forms steadier, their stones glowing brighter. The melody deepened, soft but full, and for the first time, it felt like my own voice woven into it, inseparable from the others. The square was alive now, not only with memory, but with promise. The streets no longer led away from here, they led through here. always here, and so I stayed. The square had grown so familiar now, it felt as though it had always been here, not just in this quiet corner between hills and river, but everywhere I had ever walked, everywhere I had ever longed to stop. I remained still at the fountain for what might have been moments or centuries. It no longer mattered. Time here had softened, lost its sharp edges, folded in on itself like the petals of a closing flower. The threads above stretched outward endlessly, glowing faintly, and I felt their rhythm echo inside me, not pulling, not pushing, only steady. A reminder that even in silence, there was movement. Around me, the figures had settled into their own places. Some leaned against the walls, their hands brushing faintly glowing stones set in doorways. Others sat by the river, their faces calm as they watched the silver water flow past. The boy's presence lingered, though I no longer needed to see him to feel it. He lived now in the threads, in the quiet between the stones, in the warmth that never quite left the air, and the old woman's calm approval had settled into the village, her gaze woven into the walls and windows, her kindness folded into the hum of the melody. I began to walk again, not because I needed to move, but because the village itself seemed to invite me forward. The streets curved gently beneath my feet, each corner opening into a memory I did not know I'd kept. A marketplace alive with color, a field of wildflowers swaying under a pale sky, a doorway framed in ivy, laughter echoing faintly beyond it. Each memory was soft, no, not sharp or heavy, but full of quiet warmth, as though all sorrow had been smoothed away by time and belonging. At the edge of the square, I paused. From here, the village opened before me, and beyond it, the faint threads stretched farther than sight could follow. I let my hands rest lightly on the stone railing of the bridge, feeling its hum rise into my skin. Below, the river glimmered, carrying reflections that no longer frightened me, faces of those I had known, and faces I had yet to meet, all drifting together in quiet peace. I closed my eyes, not to leave, not to forget, but to listen. The melody was clearer here, woven of countless voices and silences alike. It was not a song I could name, but it was familiar, as though I had carried it inside me all along. I spoke softly, not because the village needed my words, but because they belonged here now, as much as I did. "This is where I remain," I whispered, not to hold it all, but to let it flow through me, not to own it, but to become it. And the square, the streets, the river, the threads all seemed to echo back, "You are here." The weight of the stone in my chest no longer felt separate from me. It was no longer something I bore, but something I was, steady, glowing, full of memory, full of quiet joy. Above, the stars shifted, faint threads, weaving new patterns I could not fully understand, and for the first time, I felt no need to. The village was not only made of what had been, was made of what could be. And so, I stood there, watching the threads, feeling the rhythm of the square, and letting the quiet settle over me like a soft night. The night here now was longer dark. It glowed softly now, full of quiet warmth, like embers hidden beneath ash, waiting for the gentle breath that keeps them alive. I sat by the fountain, my hands resting lightly on the stone rim, watching the faint light ripple through the water. Around me, the villagers moved slowly, their steps soundless, their eyes calm, their faint stones glowing steadily in their chests. The boy's presence was everywhere, now woven into the sound of the river, into the hum of the stones, into the faint shimmer of the threads above. I no longer looked for him. He was simply here, as much a part of the village as the air I breathed. The old woman passed through the square once, her quiet smile glancing toward me before she vanished into the soft glow of the streets. Others drifted by as well, souls I'd never met before, but who nodded to me as though we'd known each other for centuries. Above, the stars had formed a new pattern, threads crossing and weaving, stretching farther than my mind could follow, yet all of them anchored here, to this place, to this quiet. The melody in the air had deepened, richer now, carrying notes I could not name yet somehow understood. It no longer felt like a song being sung to me. It felt like my own breath, my own heartbeat, woven into the hush of the streets. I stood and began to walk again, not with purpose, but with the quiet trust that wherever I stepped, the village would open before me. The streets curved gently, leading me past doorways bathed in faint gold, past windows where shadows moved slowly, full of peace. The river whispered beside me, its surface smooth and silver, carrying its quiet reflections without hurry. At the bridge, I paused and rested both hands on the railing. The threads above glowed faintly, shifting like silk in some unseen wind. I felt their gentle pull, not outward this time, but inward, folding me deeper into the heart of it all. The stone in my chest pulsed softly, its warmth spreading through me like morning light on quiet earth. I spoke, though there was no one to hear. "I have nothing left to give but myself," I said. "And even that is no longer mine. It belongs here now." The words melted into the air, settling into the stones, carried by the melody into the stars above. And the village answered not with words, but with a quiet hush that wrapped around me like a soft embrace. It told me, "You are enough." The river, the streets, the stones all hummed the same truth, that every step I had taken, every memory I had carried, every breath I had given to this place, had been enough. I let myself sink into that stillness. I felt the boundaries of myself blur, not disappear, but soften until I could no longer tell where my breath ended and the quiet began. For a moment, I stood at the edge of everything on the bridge, with the village behind me, the threads above me, the river below me, and I realized I was no longer waiting. I had arrived. I remained on the bridge, the faint hum of the stone in my chest blending completely with the rhythm of the village. There was no more distinction, no me and it, no before and after, only this, only now. The threads above shimmered faintly, their glow soft but steady, like veins of quiet light stretching through an endless sky. Each one pulsed gently, and I felt their rhythm in my hands, my breath, the slow beat of the stone inside me. The villagers moved around me like quiet echoes of myself. Some stood at doorways, some leaned over the river, some sat quietly beneath the faint stars. Each of them glowed, each of them steady, each of them alive in the way that only memory allows, and I felt all of them within me. I stepped forward from the bridge and returned to the square one final time. The fountain's glow was brighter now, spilling faint light into the streets and beyond. Its water no longer shimmered with just reflection, it carried the faces of every story, every memory, every whisper that had passed through this place. I knelt at its edge and touched the surface. The water was warm, and as it rippled beneath my fingers, I saw not just the past, but everything that could still come. The boy's voice came to me not from above, not from the air, but from somewhere deeper, from everywhere at once. "You have always been here," he said, "because you are what here has always been." The words settled in me, like the final piece of a long-forgotten puzzle, and I felt the last bit of resistance within me dissolve completely. I rose, the faint melody of the square growing fuller now, its notes brighter, richer. The threads above stretched outward endlessly, carrying that melody into the dark, into places I would never see but somehow already knew. The old woman appeared one last time, her figure faint but unmistakable. She placed a hand over the stone in my chest and smiled, not as though to say goodbye, but as though to welcome me home. Then she, too, faded, leaving only the warmth of her presence lingering in the air. Around me, the square fell quiet, not empty, not cold, but full of something deeper than sound. The villagers settled into their places, the river shimmered, the fountain hummed, and I stood still in the center of it all, letting the quiet fold around me. I drew a breath and let it go, and the village breathed with me. In the silence that followed, I spoke not with words, but with the calm that now lived where my heartbeat had once been. I was here, I was home, I was memory, and I would remain.